When you stop explaining yourself, everything changes. But most people never stop because they don't realize what they're actually doing. You justify why you're tired, defend boundaries with paragraphs, apologize for needing space. It feels like consideration, but this isn't politeness. It's a wound. Carl Jung identified this as seeking permission to exist. Every explanation from insecurity teaches others they control your truth. If you've spent years justifying yourself to people who will never understand, this pattern has been stealing your life. Here's what Jung discovered that changes everything. Every time you explain yourself from fear, you're not just being polite, you're fragmenting your psyche. Jung saw this across thousands of people. Successful, accomplished, seemingly put-together people. All suffering from the same invisible break. The chronic anxiety with no clear source. Decision paralysis over small choices. Emptiness no achievement fills. Self-worth that stays low despite proving yourself over and over. These aren't separate problems. They're symptoms of constant self-betrayal that most therapy never connects. Because here's the truth. When you laugh at jokes you don't find funny, say yes when everything screams no, explain your sadness as tiredness, disguise anger as logic, each one vote against your inner authority. Jung called this psyche fragmentation, the split between who you are and who you perform, and your psyche can't sustain that split. Eventually it breaks. The anxiety is your soul screaming something is wrong. The paralysis comes from not trusting your judgment. The emptiness is where your authentic self used to be. If you're recognizing yourself in this right now, stay with it. Because what comes next reveals why this keeps happening. But most people respond by managing symptoms, more therapy for coping, medication to quiet the alarms, productivity systems to push through. Jung would say you're treating smoke while the house burns. The real fire is you abandoning yourself every time you explain from fear instead of express from truth. Write in the comments the last thing you over-explained that you wish you'd just left alone. You've come this far understanding the cost. Now here's where the pattern actually locked in. This didn't start with you. It started with what happened to you. A child shows sadness. Parent says, "That's nonsense." Child shows anger, gets called difficult. Child reveals fear, gets mocked. But it's not just the words, it's the pattern that forms when this happens repeatedly. The child starts scanning, learning to read the room before expressing anything, checking faces for approval before speaking, testing reactions before sharing feelings. They develop what Jung called hypervigilance, not the kind that comes from physical danger, the kind that comes from emotional unpredictability. And here's what most people miss about this adaptation. The child isn't becoming more sensitive, they're becoming more strategic. They learn, if I can explain why I'm upset, maybe they won't dismiss me. If I can justify my anger with good enough reasons, maybe they won't punish me. If I can prove my fear is rational, maybe they won't mock me. Something breaks in this moment. The child learns their feelings only have value if they come with acceptable explanations. But here's what Jung observed about this survival strategy. It doesn't just change how the child communicates. It changes how they experience their own emotions. They stop feeling first and expressing second. They start justifying first and feeling second. The internal voice becomes an editor, not a witness. Every emotion gets run through a filter. Is this reasonable? Will others understand this? Can I defend this if challenged? If you recognize this internal editor in yourself, that voice that questions every feeling before you fully feel it, that's the wound still operating. The real self gets buried under layers of justification. The explaining self takes over, and the message that burns into their unconscious, I can only exist if others allow it. Fast forward to adolescence, to early adulthood. The pattern deepens. They become the friend who apologizes for having needs, the partner who defends their boundaries instead of simply stating them. the employee who builds elaborate justifications for basic requests. What worked for a powerless child becomes the operating system for the adult, and that survival pattern never got updated. You don't choose to become someone who explains compulsively. You adapt to survive an emotionally invalidating environment. And here's what therapists rarely connect. That childhood adaptation is still running your relationships, your career, your entire life. The wound isn't that you explain yourself. The wound is that you learned you need permission to feel what you feel. Stay with this, because what happens when you stop explaining is where everything shifts. Jung understood that silence from integrity, not avoidance, shuts down the entire control system, feeding on your insecurity. When you stop justifying yourself, people respond to it energetically before they consciously understand what shifted. They say, "You've changed, not in a good way." You respond, "I have." They demand, "You owe me an explanation." You hold, "I'm taking space." That's all you need to know. They accuse, "You're being selfish." You accept, "I'm prioritizing myself." Call that what you want. Notice what's happening. You're not being cruel. You're refusing to put your truth on trial. But here's what Jung observed that most people miss. This silence doesn't just protect you from manipulation. It reveals the truth of your relationships. Ones built on real connection adapt. Ones built on your compliance collapse. If the thought of people leaving terrifies you, understand this is exactly where the old wound tries to pull you back. Some people will leave. That's not failure. That's your silence working as a filter, showing who was there for you versus who was there for what you provided through self-abandonment. But here's what therapists rarely explain about this filtering process. When you stop explaining yourself externally, you finally start hearing yourself internally. Share in the comments one emotion you've been rationalizing instead of actually feeling. You're seeing the pattern. Now watch how it's running your daily life without you realizing it. Boss asks why you need a day off. You build an elaborate story about appointments when personal reasons would work. Friend asks why you left early. Can't say I was tired. You justify. Work was hard. Didn't sleep well. Have plans tomorrow. Someone questions your boundary. Instead of holding it, you explain, justify, provide evidence it's reasonable. As if boundaries need to pass someone else's logic test. The exhaustion doesn't come from the situations, it comes from constant performance. Jung identified this as loss of internal authority. Your center shifted outward. Instead of validating your experience from within, you outsourced it to others. Every time you explain from fear, you communicate. I don't trust my own experience. I need you to tell me if what I'm feeling is okay. And the world responds. People learn they can question your boundaries. Your decisions are negotiable. If they push, you'll cave. But this doesn't just affect relationships with others. It destroys your relationship with yourself in ways most people never connect. You stop trusting intuition, question every feeling, doubt authentic responses. You've lost touch with who you actually are. If you're feeling the weight of how much you've given away, that awareness is actually the first step toward reclaiming it. If you've ever set a boundary without explaining it, comment what happened. How did people react? You've made it this far understanding the problem. Now here's the solution Jung spent his life teaching. Jung's entire work centers on one shift: internal authority, the ability to validate your own experience without external approval. The center moves from the edge of approval back to your core. You stop asking, will they understand? You start asserting, it doesn't matter if they understand. This is true for me. This shift is real, not theoretical. It gets built through practice, choosing your truth over their comfort, again and again. Communication transforms. Instead of explaining from fear of being misunderstood, you express from wholeness. You share truth as a gift, not a plea for acceptance. Explaining from fear says, please approve of me. Expressing from authority says, this is my truth. Receive it or don't. Internal authority shows up in small daily moves, saying no without elaborating, changing your mind without justifying, ending conversations that don't serve you, holding boundaries when questioned. Most powerfully, and this is what most people never learn, feeling something deeply without needing anyone to validate it's reasonable. Someone asks why you're upset. Instead of building a case, I'm processing something. I'll share when I'm ready. Family questions your choices. Instead of defending, I understand you see it differently. This is right for me. Colleague pushes on your boundary. Instead of explaining, I'm not available for that. If these examples make you anxious, notice that. The anxiety is your old pattern sensing it's being threatened. But here's what Jung warned about that most people aren't prepared for. Developing this authority means walking through what he called the desert of inner solitude, where you realize no explanation will make certain people understand, where you see some relationships were built entirely on your performance, where you feel the weight of standing in your truth even when it disappoints others. The urge to go back to explaining will surface. The old pattern whispers if you could just make them understand, everything would be okay. That's exactly when to hold silence, because every time you resist that urge, you build internal authority. You vote for yourself. The psyche reorganizes around a new center. Self-worth stops being negotiable. Boundaries become solid. Your truth becomes yours. Comment below, what part of yourself have you been hiding to be more acceptable? Stay with this, because what emerges on the other side is where the real transformation shows up. There's something magnetic about someone who stopped explaining themselves. Jung understood this as psychological integrity. When you no longer trade your essence for approval, an integrated person doesn't beg to be understood. They communicate, express, but don't convince. Their words come from a solid center, not hidden lack. And people sense this before they consciously understand what's different. The world treats with more respect those who respect themselves, and self-respect starts when you refuse to negotiate what's essential in you. Integrity has weight, has presence. And here's what most psychology misses. It can't be faked or performed. Without words, a centered person alters room dynamics. They don't prove anything. Their coherence communicates everything. They walk differently, grounded, belonging to themselves first. Hold silence where others fill space with explanation. Say, that doesn't work for me, without guilt. Receive criticism without defending. Make decisions and stand by them when questioned. Here's the thing Jung identified. The less you seek approval, the more respect you naturally get. Because integrity is rare. If this feels impossible for you right now, you're not broken. You're just still operating from the old wound. Most people are so fragmented, performing, desperate for validation that they unconsciously recognize someone who is whole. This isn't about superiority. It's about being real. And when this settles in, watch what happens to every relationship dynamic in your life. You stop attracting people who need you small. Start connecting with those who meet you in wholeness. Professional dynamics shift. Instead of being guilted into extra work, your boundaries get respected. Personal relationships reorganize. People who stayed because you were convenient fade. Ones who genuinely see you become clearer. But here's what Jung understood that goes deeper than just behavior change. When you stop explaining yourself, you don't just act differently. You put out a different frequency. Jung understood the psyche gets guided by energy, presence, internal structure, not rational justifications. Someone constantly trying to be understood broadcasts submission and doubt. They send, please validate me, please approve of me. Someone with internal authority broadcasts strength and clarity. They send, I know who I am. Your understanding is welcome but not required. People respond to this before consciously understanding what shifted. Suddenly, people stop questioning your boundaries as much. Stop expecting justification for choices. Stop treating your no as negotiation. And here's what most people never realize. You didn't demand this respect. You emanated it. Respect radiates from internal match between who you are and how you present. When there's no split, no performance, no fragmentation, when you're the same alone as in public, that integrity transmits. If you're worried this makes you heartless, understand that integrity doesn't make you cold, it makes you honest. And honest compassion beats performed kindness. You can care deeply without carrying, love without losing yourself, be present without being porous. You've come this far. Now here's the part Jung didn't romanticize, the crossing most people aren't willing to make. Jung called it traversing the desert of inner solitude. And it's brutal. Because when you start holding silence, the part of you trained for decades to seek approval will panic. You'll feel guilt for disappointing people, anxiety about being misunderstood, fear of losing relationships. The urge to just explain one more time will feel overwhelming. This is the moment most people turn back. They decide it's easier to just keep explaining, safer to perform, less painful to abandon themselves than risk others abandoning them. But Jung observed something. The people who push through this desert emerge transformed, because the desert strips away everything false. They realize their fears were about losing things that were never real. Relationships built on their compliance, not their truth. Approval that required constant performance, not authentic connection. Every connection that depended on you being small. Every dynamic where you had to justify your existence. What most people don't understand is these weren't losses. They were releases. What remains is what's real. What can withstand your wholeness? If you're in this desert right now, feeling the loneliness of finally choosing yourself, know that this discomfort is not failure. It's the old self dying, so the real one can emerge. And here's what changes on the other side. You stop living for an audience. Stop translating your experience into something others will approve. Stop asking permission to feel what you feel. Your existence stops being negotiable. The privilege Jung talked about, becoming who you truly are, finally becomes possible. Because you're no longer abandoning yourself for acceptance. Every time you silence an explanation born from fear, you reaffirm yourself. Build integrity. Take your place, not as someone begging for space, but someone who knows they belong. This isn't perfection. Old patterns resurface. The pull to justify will return. But each time you notice and choose differently, you rewire decades of conditioning. Build the internal authority Jung knew was essential for real freedom. The people who matter won't be threatened by your silence. They'll respect it, meet you in wholeness. The ones who resist, demand explanations, try to guilt you back. They were never connected to the real you. Just what you provided through self-betrayal. Write in the comments. What explanation do you repeat that you know you don't need to give anymore? Name it. Your wholeness doesn't require anyone's understanding. Your truth doesn't need approval. Your existence is not negotiable.